As a Christian woman who has gone through divorce, you've probably felt left to fend for yourself, maybe for your kids too. Exposed, discarded in some way. Not by everyone, but by the one man who promised to cover you. I say that based on years of conversations with hundreds, if not thousands, of divorced women. That same wound shows up every time in different ways, but with the same ache. You were built to be covered, and you never fully received it. In Genesis 38, a widow named Tamar knew that ache firsthand. She was abandoned by the man responsible for her. She had every reason to believe God had abandoned her as well, but he hadn't. Today, what she did in response to losing it, what Judah declared about her, and why God wrote her into the direct lineage of Jesus. I am Katie Ann, and this is Beyond Believing, episode 108, recently named one of the top Christian divorce podcasts on the web. I'm so glad you're here. Let's go. Your uncovering might have looked physical if he left and you found yourself carrying everything alone overnight. It might have looked emotional if he stayed in the house but was never really present or available for you. It might have been mental or spiritual if you needed him to lead, protect, or fight for you, and he simply didn't. However it happened, somewhere inside your marriage or your divorce, you were left uncovered. And Tamar knew that exact uncovering thousands of years before you did. The century is different, but the wound is not. Let me tell you about mine. My own uncovering happened very early in my marriage, though it took me years to understand what I was actually experiencing at the time. Not long after we married, I remember realizing that I wasn't only responsible for myself anymore. I felt the weight of being responsible for my husband as well, for his well-being, his emotions, sometimes even for his choices. And I want to be clear here because this isn't a story about placing blame or painting him in an unkind light. It isn't even about not wanting to carry my responsibility as a wife. Because as I've grown and healed, I've come to feel deep compassion for both of us in that season. Because the truth is, neither of us had ever really learned how to give love or receive it. We were both carrying wounds we didn't even have language for yet. And now that I understand marriage from a biblical perspective, what covering actually means, what protection looks like, what it means to build a home unto the Lord, it is painfully clear what was missing in those early days. But I didn't have that understanding at the time. And honestly, my ex-husband didn't have it either. And he still doesn't. And I want to say plainly that is not a failure that belongs to him alone. Here's what I have come to believe. He could not cover me because he had never received covering himself. Not in his own home growing up, not anywhere along the way. And you cannot give someone something you have never received yourself. Now, that is not an excuse for what happened. It's just an explanation. And it's exactly why I'm so passionate about the work I do now, because this was never really just a marriage problem between two people. It's a covering problem. A broken cycle of what marriage was actually meant to be, handed down generation after generation without anyone ever meaning for it to happen that way. I want you to hear this clearly because it matters for everything we're about to talk about. This is not a new problem. It isn't the product of a progressive culture or some modern crisis in marriage. This is a human problem. It has existed since the very beginning because we have always been vulnerable to the enemy's lies about who we are, who God is, and what he actually intends marriage, covering, and love to look like. And that is exactly where Tamar's story comes in. She is not the first woman in Scripture left unprotected by the man responsible for her, but she is the one we're sitting with today. Because what happened to her and what she was never given tells us something we all need to hear. So let's go back to where her story actually begins. Now, when I started studying this chapter for myself and learned the specific details buried in it, I knew I had to bring them to you too. So let's sit inside Tamar's story together, straight from the text. Genesis 38, 6 through 11 says, "And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, 'Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother.' But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring for his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, 'Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up,' for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house." Now I want you to notice something with me. This passage names sin 3 separate times in 3 different men. Was wicked in the sight of the Lord, though what that is not specified. Onan sinned as well, and scripture is specific about what that was, refusing to give Tamar the heir she was owed, because that child would have carried his brother's name and inheritance instead of his own. And then there's Judah. His sin is not explicitly stated here, but it is evident in this phrase. He feared he would die like his brothers. Judah never intended to give Tamar to Shelah. He sent her away because he was more focused on saving his last son than recognizing the sin in his 2 older sons. But that isn't all. His sin goes further than that. Though it isn't named with the same word here, I think we're meant to see it anyway because of exactly where this chapter sits. If you go back just 1 chapter to Genesis 37, you will find Judah standing over a pit with his brother Joseph inside it. His brothers want him dead, and it is Judah who speaks up, but not to save Joseph out of love, but because he sees a lucrative option. He says, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites." Now, Judah does not stop the harm or protect his brother. He monetizes it. And then he goes home and lets his father believe his favorite son is dead and lives inside that lie for years. That is the character of the man walking into chapter 38. And I don't think it's an accident that his own story is placed right here, right after that. Now, commentators have long pointed to this placement as significant. This is the chapter where we see exactly who Judah is before the transformation that's still ahead of him, the one that eventually makes him willing to offer his own life for his brother Benjamin's freedom. But he is not that man yet. Right now, he's a man who covers up hard truths instead of facing them, who lets someone else absorb the cost of his choices. And then his own sons do the exact same thing. Onan deceives his brother's memory for his own gain, and Judah himself deceives Tamar, sending her away under a promise he has no intention of keeping. Deception answering deception. Scripture doesn't spell out cause and effect between father and sons in so many words, but the pattern sitting right next to it itself in these chapters is hard to miss. Under the custom of that culture, Tamar had a legal right to a 3rd husband once Shelah came of age. It wasn't a request. It was her right, and it was Judah's obligation to fulfill it. Old Testament scholar George Coates points to this as the real crux of the chapter, not the scandal Tamar is usually remembered for, but a widow whose rights inside her father-in-law's household simply weren't honored. Richard Clifford's work on this chapter's placement inside the wider Joseph narrative points to exactly this kind of contrast. Judah's failure here set right against Joseph's integrity in the chapters that follow. And Mark Luchter's research into the social world behind Genesis 38 shows how ordinary this kind of failure was in that culture. Not always outright cruelty. Sometimes just a man who never learned to carry responsibility, so he let someone else carry it instead. Now, Tamar did not stay quiet. And when the truth finally came out, the very man who sold his own brother and sent his own daughter-in-law away is the one who says something about her that neither of them saw coming. Here's how we get there. So here's what Tamar actually did once she understood Judah had no intention of keeping his promise. Genesis 38:14 tells us she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and sat in a place along the road Judah would travel. And then the text gives us her reason plainly. It says, "For she saw that Shelah was grown up and she had not been given to him in marriage." That is not a detail we should skip past. Scripture itself is telling us her motive before Judah ever shows up in the story. She is acting because the promise made to her was still unpaid, not because she was pursuing some kind of encounter with her father-in-law. Then verse 15 says, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. I want you to notice exactly what that sentence is doing, because it isn't telling us what Tamar was. It's telling us what Judah assumed and why, because of a veil. But there's something else worth knowing. Veiling wasn't only associated with women selling themselves in that culture. It was also part of how a bride would have presented herself before marriage. So the very detail Judah reads one way could just as easily point another direction entirely, toward a woman positioning herself to finally be given the marriage she was owed, not a woman seeking to seduce him. Judah draws the conclusion he draws, but the text never confirms that conclusion as true. It only tells us it's what he thought. Even her question to him carries more weight than it first appears. What will you give me? Think about what Judah had actually failed to give her by this point in the chapter. A husband, an heir, which for a woman in her position was the only future she had, and covering. The very thing this whole episode began with, the protection and provision a father-in-law owed the widow left in his household. He failed to give her any of it. Now, the very man who withheld what he owed her is the one asking her for something. She asks him plainly, what will you give me? And what she secures in that moment isn't the goat he offers, it's his signet, cord, and staff, his own identifying possessions. Now hold on to these three objects. They're about to become the most important thing in this entire story. Whatever else was in her mind at that moment, Judah did not recognize her, negotiated a payment, left his pledge, and went on his way. Now, she still participated, so I'm not saying she's innocent, but she went home, put on her widow's garments, and waited. 3 months later, Judah is told Tamar is pregnant and assumed to have acted immorally. His response is immediate and severe. He says, bring her out and let her be burned. No investigation, no question asked of her directly, just judgment. The same judgment he'd already assumed about her back at the roadside, now escalated to a death sentence. But listen to how Tamar responds, because I think this is the most important moment in the whole chapter, because she doesn't argue. She doesn't even defend herself with words. As she's being brought out, she simply sends a message to the very man calling for her death. She says, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. Please identify whose these are, the signet, the cord, and the staff. Now, there's a detail in the original Hebrew that is easy to skip right past, and once you see it, you won't read this story the same way again. And this is why I love the Bible, because the Hebrew word Tamar uses here, translated identify or please recognize, is the exact same word, used the exact same way back in Genesis 37 when Judah and his brothers bring Joseph's blood-stained coat to their father and say, this we have found, please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. It is the exact same Hebrew word, in the exact same request that Judah once helped use an identifying object to bury the truth about his brother. Now Tamar uses Judah's own identifying objects to bring the truth about himself into the light. And notice how she does it. She doesn't stand there and accuse him publicly. She simply sends the items and asks him, the exact same way he asked his father, to recognize them. The recognition has to happen inside of Judah on his own. And it does. In verse 26 of chapter 38, it says, "Then Judah identified them and said, 'She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah.' And he did not know her again." I want to be really precise here because this matters. God does not speak this verdict, Judah does. This is his own confession, and Moses records it as scripture. A man in front of witnesses admitting that the woman he was ready to burn alive for his assumed immorality had acted with more integrity than he ever had. He doesn't say she did nothing wrong. He says his own withheld promise, his own fear, his own deception, his own character made him the one who bore the greater guilt. And this marks a very specific change in Judah's character going forward. Because not long after this, Judah is the one who offers himself to replace Benjamin. Judah is the one who is changed. Now, friend, God did not abandon Tamar. He never spoke audibly in this chapter, never appeared in a vision, never sent a prophet to intervene. And yet he was present in every part of it. In the truth Scripture preserves about her real motive, even when the man in the story assumed the worst, in the risk she took to reclaim what she was owed, and in the moment that truth finally surfaced instead of staying buried. God's presence in this story isn't loud, it's woven in. And here's how we know it wasn't just woven in quietly, it was woven in permanently. Because Tamar gave birth to twins, Perez and Zerah. Perez becomes part of the direct line that leads to Boaz, to David, and ultimately to Jesus. The woman who was uncovered, misjudged, still labeled as immoral, and nearly executed on an assumption is not a footnote in the story of redemption. She is inside of it, named, counted, and written into the direct lineage of the Messiah. Friend, come back with me to where we started. Post-divorce, you have felt left to fend for yourself, exposed, discarded in some way by the one who was supposed to cover you. That wound is real. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't. But here is what Tamar's story hands back to you. And I'm not suggesting here you model her choice to reclaim what was yours. You were built to be covered, and a man's failure to give you that covering does not erase your place in God's story. Tamar was denied a husband, an heir, a future, and covering, and God still wrote her into the direct lineage of the Messiah. You are not the reputation someone else assigned you. You are not disqualified because someone else withheld what they owed you. You are not abandoned even in the seasons when it feels like heaven has gone silent. God was not absent from Tamar's wilderness, and he was not absent from yours. He does not only see what was taken from you, he has already written what comes next. Friend, if this touched something in you, I don't want that to just end with this episode. God does not just leave you with a wound named. He wants to be known by you personally, the same way he was present for Tamar even when it looked like nobody was watching. That is exactly why I created Roots. It is a free 7-day devotional built around one question Jesus asked his own disciples. Who do you say that I am? It is not a course. It is not a program. It is 7 days of sitting with who God actually is to you personally, in the middle of what you are walking through. You can find it at roots.coachkatieann.com. I would be honored to walk those 7 days with you. You will find that link along with a few other ways to go deeper with this work in the show notes. And next week, we are continuing on with the story of the women written into the lineage of Jesus. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I'll see you then. Have a great week, friend.